So this is Research Methods, Unit 2, Part 3, on Writing and Psychology. So it's really important that you cite all of the references that you use in your paper. So imagine that you are using as the basis of your paper an article by John Smith. It's paramount important for you to cite this both in the paper and at the end in the works cited section. This is critical because if you do not cite properly, your professor can accuse you of plagiarism. Plagiarism is a concept that you've probably heard before in other classes, and it basically boils down to the idea that what you're doing is using someone else's ideas as your own. Just as if I stole someone's wallet and used their money to pay for something for myself, plagiarism is using someone else's ideas and claiming that they were your own. And just as it'll get you in trouble if you steal someone's wallet and use their money to buy something, you'll get in trouble if you steal someone's ideas and claim that they're your own. And one of the reasons why it's an even bigger problem than stealing someone's wallet is that in the case of a stolen wallet, the cash that you find has no trace. So there's no way of tracing back the $50 that you might have had or you might have found in a wallet. But in academia, most work is published. So it's very easy for someone to go back and find the original source that you were using and say, aha, I see that you have taken material from someone else and passed it off as your own. The consequences of plagiarism are severe. In the context of being a student at a university, you can be suspended for a quarter, or in severe cases, you can be actually expelled permanently from the university. And while that's for cases of very extreme plagiarism, any plagiarism you want to avoid, because at the end of the day, if you get accused of it and convicted of it, it goes in your permanent school record. And that's not something that you want to have to explain at a job interview or explain when you want to apply for graduate school. So it's really important that you cite everything that you use. It doesn't hurt to cite. It's not painful. It's not time consuming. But it's responsible. It's the right thing to do. Just like if you were walking across campus and you found someone's wallet on the ground, the right thing to do is to bring it to the police station. In the same sense, the right thing to do if you find someone else's ideas is to make sure that they get attributed to those ideas, because the consequences of ignoring this advice are dire, and you really don't want that. You really, really don't. I've had students that have plagiarized in my class, and they were caught, and I had to turn them in to the administration. And for the most part, they were suspended for what they did. And even though today I'm a little bit more lenient in not seeking that kind of punishment, because I feel that when someone plagiarizes, it's more of a learning moment. You're going to find that other professors are not so lenient as I am. And so don't test these waters. It's not worth it. Now, in citing things, what you're going to be using for the most part are the conventions set forth by the American Psychological Association, which is detailed in a book called the APA Manual of Style. I think the current edition is edition 6, and unless otherwise stated, assume that what you're going to be doing is citing an APA format. Now, it's useful to own this book if you're a psychology major, because it provides every possible scenario in which you must cite something. So, for instance, if you're citing a record, there's a particular way that you need to cite that, as opposed to if you're citing something on the World Wide Web. There are these conventions that are applied to different sources that you kind of need to know how to cite these different kinds of sources. However, I do want to say that if you want to save yourself a couple of bucks, You can find on the World Wide Web guides that have been based on the book, the manual of style, that provide you with as much guidance as the book itself. So it's not necessary to own the book, but if you plan on going to graduate school or if you want to make psychology your profession, it's worth having a copy, even if it's one that you only look at once every couple of years. But keep this in mind. You really have to cite. So when we talk about citation and references, a citation is a reference to another work in your paper. It can be your own or it can be someone else's. And that's an important point. If you wrote a paper in the past and it was published, you can't just use ideas from that paper and cite them as new. You have to cite your prior work. If you look at any of the articles that I've written after the first article, you'll see that I cite myself. And I do that because it's important to attribute myself as a former author of ideas. Just because it was me doesn't mean that I have ownership over those ideas. Once it is published, it becomes part of the record and you need to cite it. And you always cite your sources. There's never a reason why you shouldn't cite the sources that you use to obtain your ideas. It always pays to cite. And no one will ever criticize you from citing too much. But people will criticize you from citing too little. And as I said, failure to cite sources is considered plagiarism, which is defined as when you use someone else's work and present it as your own. And just keep in mind that plagiarism isn't just copying word for word someone else's work, like going to Wikipedia and copying a paragraph and putting it into your paper, which you might think that that's a ridiculous thing to do, but I've had students do that on a number of occasions. So it's not as if this is something which I am beating a dead horse dead. This is important for you all to know. And it's also when you use someone else's ideas without giving them credit. So you might not copy them word for word. You might summarize what they say. But it's very important that once you summarize them, you cite them. Because if you fail to cite, then you are liable to be charged with plagiarism. And as I said before, you do not want that. So here's an example of one of my own articles on how to cite. So there was an author named Piaget who co-authored a book with someone named Inhelder and someone named Szymanska. And so this provides you with a couple of examples of how to cite. So what I wrote in this article is that Piaget, Inhelder, and Szymanska 1960 claimed that infants and young children have a limited capacity to encode quantitative information about continuous extent until the emergence of measurement skills during the school-age years. However, recent studies provide evidence that even infants can encode object extent and distance. And then you see in brackets I have Huttenlocher, Duffy, and Levine, 2002, Feigenson, Carey, and Spelke, 2002, Bayerjan, Kotowski, and Needham, 1994. And I want to make a point about this, is that these are some of the details about citing that you need to know from the book or from using the textbook or from the internet. That, for instance, when I have authors that are written into a sentence, like the first sentence of this little excerpt, the authors are included as part of the sentence, in which case I have to write the word "and" between the two authors that are the second and third author. However, look at the bottom. When I cite things in brackets, okay, which are called parenthetical references, I use the ampersand or that little end symbol. Okay, so you can see how there's the difference between the and the end that are used in both cases. You can also see some other little details that, in the first case, there's not a comma after Szymanska, but when it's parenthetical, there's a comma after the last author. So you can see a comma after Levine, after Spelke, and after Needham. These are some of the little rules that are worth learning. And I will put up online a guidebook, a little guideline for how to cite things like this. Now, I want to point out that for most of you, you're only going to be citing one of three things: a book, a journal article, or a chapter. It's very rare that you're going to be citing a, compact disc, a song, or something like that. So for the most part, there's really only like a couple of rules you need to learn, even though the APA manual has some 70 pages about how to cite different things. Honestly, 98% of the time, you're going to be citing one of three things: a journal article, a book, or a chapter. And you can see here another difference is that when I cite something that's in a sentence, as I did in the first sentence here, I put brackets around the year that it was published. However, when I do parenthetical references, as in the bottom, I put a comma after the last author's name and then put the year without brackets. And I separate each of those authors, the different works, by a semicolon, which you can see right after 2002, 2002, and that's one of the differences that you need to know. Now, again, I'm going to provide you with a guideline on this, but just understand that this is something that you need to get right. And by the time that you're done with your psychology degree, hopefully you'll have this down pat. Even if you never have to deal with this again in your life, even if you never write another psychology article, this is something that you really need to learn as part of your degree. It's almost like, in any field where you need to learn how to do the details correct, whether it be in journalism, whether it be in a sport, understanding that you have to dribble a basketball until you throw the ball into the air, or that, in soccer, you can't touch the ball with your arm. These are just rules that you have to learn. And as boring as they may seem, they're really important in order to be a good writer in psychology. So, citations in the text of an article consist of a list of the author's last names and the year of the publication. So, what I'm trying to say here is that when you're writing your text of your introduction, you're not going to be putting in the name of the journal, the name of the article. All you do is, as I did in the last slide, you cite the author's last names and the year of publication. And when you use this in a sentence, you separate the last authors from the rest using the word and. And when in parentheses, you use the ampersand symbol. So, as I show in this example below, Duffy, Huttenlocher, and Levine demonstrate that 4-year-olds rely on relative information. That's one way of doing it, where I include the authors as part of the sentence. In the next one, 4-year-olds rely on relative information, and then I provide the parenthetical reference. You have Duffy, Huttenlocher, ampersand, Levine, comma, 2005. So just look at that for a second as an example of one of the little details that you need to know when you write a paper. Now, for me, if you get this wrong, I would not penalize you severely for a draft that you give me. I would say to you, I would circle it and I'd say, do this right the next time. But for a final paper for this class, and for final papers that you might write for other higher level courses that you take in the psychology department, you want to get this right. Because if you don't get it right, you look sloppy. And the last thing that people want in a writer is sloppiness. Because if you have sloppy writing, then it indicates that you have sloppy thinking. And you don't want that at all. Now, at the end of your paper, what you're going to provide is a reference section that provides you with all of the works that you cite in the writing that you do. And this is part of the book that the APA puts out, but also will be part of the guideline that I put up. And it provides you with how you make reference in this works cited section to the works that you read and wrote about. So, for instance, when you're citing a journal article, what you're going to do is you're going to have the order of the authors that appear in the journal article: last name first, comma, first initial period, and then a comma, and then the second author, last name first, comma, first initial period, comma, and then ampersand, the last author, comma, first name period, and then in brackets, or in parentheses, the year, and then a period, and then the title of the article. So In this case, the article is called Infants and Toddlers' Discriminated Amount. Are they measuring? Now, the first letter of each of those words should be lowercase except for the first word and any word that's after a comma. As you can see there, the word infant is capitalized and the word R, the A, is capitalized. And then you have the name of the journal in italics. The journal is Psychological Science. The issue of the journal, because journals have each year is a different number, so this is the 13th year of the journal Psychological Science, that should be italicized. And then after a comma, you have the page numbers. So the page numbers in which this appeared were 244 to 249, and then a period. And those are not italicized. Where did people come up with this? I don't know. It's just the way in which people have been doing it for years, so you have to do it this way as well. So as much as I think that some of these conventions are a little crazy, it's what we all have to do. Now, when you have a chapter in a book, imagine when I spoke recently about this, you have situations where you have people who edit a book where each chapter is written by a different person. In this case, what you do is you have the authors of the chapter, in this case it's Bayer-Jean, R period, Kotowski, L period, ampersand Needham, A period, year 1995, in brackets or parentheses, period, the acquisition of physical knowledge in infancy. And you can notice that the first word is capitalized, or the first letter of the first word, and the rest of them is not. And then you have the editor of the book. So in D period Sperber and D period Premack, okay, and notice that you don't have first name first there. You have last name first there. You have the first initial first. And then you have parentheses EDS, which means editors, period. And then you have the name of the book. Causal cognition, brackets, a multidisciplinary approach. And because that's a book, you capitalize the first letter of each word. And then you have in parentheses the page number. So PP, period, which means pages, 79 to 116. And then you have a period. And then you have the location of its publication, New York, and then the publisher, which is Clarendon. And finally, if you're citing a book, you would have the last name first, Nunez, T, period, and Bryant, P, period, 1986, in parentheses, period. Children doing mathematics. Cambridge, Massachusetts, the place of publication, Blackwell. Now, that may be, if you look at the slide, a little bit wrong. I think that if it was a book, the word doing mathematics should be capitalized as well. But there have been some changes between the older and the newer version of the APA manual style. And honestly, if you make small errors like that, that's not going to be critical. Whenever you submit a journal article to a journal, there are copy editors that fix these things for you. So just keep that in mind, is that it's not the end of the world if you do some of the stuff a little bit wrong. Everyone makes a mistake here and there. It's typographic, it's not conceptual, and you'll eventually get it right. Now, there's one thing I want to point out, is that when you're writing a manuscript, most of the time when you have figures or tables, so when you have pictures, you provide them at the end of the paper after the reference section. Now, one thing I want to point out is that this has changed between the 5th and 6th edition of the APA format guide. And more recent versions of the format guide allow you to have figures and tables actually included within the manuscript itself. So these things are things that change, but I just want to point out that for the most part, when you write a manuscript, you'll include the figures and tables at the very end of the paper. So I think it's important for us to talk a bit about style, which refers to certain aesthetic aspects of the paper, by which I mean Certain papers are written really well, in which you could say they're beautiful, and other ones are written really poorly, in which you can say, that they have a lot of work to be done to make them look like a painting or a sculpture. And so, one of the most important aspects of style is clarity. Clarity has to do with the fact that every sentence should have a clear meaning that cannot be misinterpreted. Because the worst thing is to write a sentence and have someone misinterpret what you said, where you wanted to say that, Philadelphia is on the east coast of the United States, and all you say is that Philadelphia is on the east coast. Well, many countries have east coasts. So if you didn't know Philadelphia was a city in the United States, then you may totally mistake the east coast of the United States with the east coast of, say, Japan, and assume that that it's Philadelphia is on the Pacific Ocean, which it's not. It's on the Atlantic, and so clarity really has to do with ambiguity, and ambiguity is really not tolerable. In academic writing, you really need to be writing specifically so that people know exactly what you're saying and that there's no room for interpretation. Because, again, we're not writing poetry here. We're writing academic work, which, is straightforward and not flowery, but is to the point. And to that point, brevity. Be specific. It's often the case with writing that less is sometimes more. As I said before, one of the problems that you have when you're starting out in academia, when you're a student, is that you can't write enough. So I assign a 7-page paper, you can only come up with 4 pages. So you come up with creative ways of making 4 pages look like 7 pages. You make the font be 12.5 points. You separate words, But in reality, the problem really in academics is making it smaller, to making it shorter, to making it more to the point. So brevity really is the heart of style. So what you really want is to make your words be sweet and short. And then there's another term called felicity, which is your reader should encounter your writing and not have to take out a dictionary. They should not have to go to Wikipedia and look up jargon. They should be able to understand what you write and be able to interpret it without having to deal with dense and difficult terminology that makes it harder to interpret. We all know that there are people out there that like to impress others with big words like anti-discipline. I can hardly say the word, to be honest with you, but anti-disestablishmentarianism. It's a 23-letter word, and it has something to do with the Reformation in the English Church. The point is that, although that takes up a lot of room, not that many people know what that word means. So once you put a word that's 23 letters long in your article, people are just going to lose interest because they're not going to understand what you're trying to say. So what you really want to do is avoid flowery language, which is hard to interpret, because at the end of the day, you're writing a scientific document. You're not writing an essay. You're not writing poetry. You're trying to get your point across. And the best way to do that is to avoid big words that require referencing dictionaries and encyclopedias and whatever. You want to be sweet, short, and to the point. The next important point is that you need to really avoid sexist language, particularly now that we are at a point in history in the 21st century where it's really important to, in your writing, to open the door for equality in terms of the people you're talking with and reducing bias. So you want to really avoid biased language. So a term like mankind is, although probably okay in the 1800s or in the early part of the 1900s, mankind is not an ideal word. Humankind might be a better term. When you're talking about Native Americans, you don't want to use the term Indians, because if you know a little bit about history, the reason why Indians are called Indians in America is because early sailors mistook the country of India for the New World. And so there was a huge mistake that was made where the people that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean mistook the New World with India. So you don't want to make that mistake. And the term Oriental, that's a archaic word talking about parts of Asia. You really don't want to talk about, and there's an author named Edward Said that wrote a book called Occidentalism that is probably a 500-page book about the problems of the term Oriental, because what it does is it groups a whole huge billion member part of a population into one. Those are bad terms. Better would be humankind for mankind, Native Americans or indigenous people for Indians, and East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians for Orientals. Those are the more 21st century terms for those parts of the world. So another important thing is never to refer to participants in your studies using gender-specific personal pronouns unless the article is about such groups. Okay? So imagine that you're doing a study where your subjects, your participants, are all women in a shelter for women. Well, then it's fine to use her. Or if you're dealing with a group of sub-participants that are, men, in some sort of situation in which you only are dealing with men. Unless you're doing that, you really want to avoid using gender-specific pronouns. So it's probably better to use him, her, his, her. Use something that encompasses everyone instead of assuming that there's just one gender in your sample. And it's also important to avoid labeling subjects by gender or ethnicity unless it's warranted by the topic of the paper. So if you're doing a cross-cultural study where you're studying North Americans and Japanese, there's no reason to mention ethnicity if you're not doing a paper that deals with a comparison between the two groups. You only if it's the point that you want to make of the paper that, say, North Americans and Japanese perform differently on a task, say, math knowledge, that you would want to focus on that. Otherwise, it's better to avoid sexist, culturalist kind of language. We live in the 21st century. We have left the 19th. So I also want to mention that there are steps in the publication process that you might not be familiar with because you've never published something in a journal. But an important step is called peer review. And that's something that you really need to know about, because the way in which an article is submitted to a journal, it's not the case that you just write something and you send it to a journal and they publish it. Not at all. What happens is that when you submit something to a journal to be considered for publication, the editor of the journal sends it to a variety of other researchers that are in the same field. And these scholars, they read it, they criticize it, and they give suggestions to the editor as to whether the article should be accepted, revised, or rejected. Now, the vast majority of articles that are submitted get rejected. It's just the nature of the way in which academia works, is that there are so many people working in this field that there are too many articles that are being submitted that are inappropriate maybe for the journal that they're submitted to, or the audience, might think that it's too specific. But if you write an article and it is, appropriate for the journal, it can either be accepted or revised. And most often things are revised. It's very rare. It's, I think, maybe only in 3% of articles that are submitted to journals that they're accepted outright. Most of the time, you submit it to the editor, he sends it to peer reviewed, so he sends it to other people. They read it, they have comments, they send it back to the editor sends it back to you and says, we want you to revise this. And what you do as an author is that you revise it by editing it, by changing different parts of it, and you resubmit it. And then they send it back to those scholars, and if they're happy with what you did, they accept it, or they send it for another round and you have to revise it again. And
if it's accepted, all is good. But this never happens. It never happens that you submit an article and it's just accepted outright. But if you're asked to revise, you must respond to the criticisms of the reviewers and rewrite the parts of your paper. And then, after a couple of rounds of reviews, you end up being able to publish the paper in the journal. But if you're rejected, it's really bad. And what you have to do is find another journal that's more appropriate to the topic that you're writing about, or you have to significantly revise your paper, or the worst is you have to just forget about it. Maybe you had an idea that just was not had its time, or it just was not appropriate for being published at this time, or you didn't do a good job, and no matter what you do, it will not be accepted. So that's another important point to keep in mind.